Hello and welcome to Cargo Shorts, brought to you by Old Dominion Freight Line. I'm your host, Jonathan Betz, and today we take a closer look at the domestic supply chain and how manufacturers are navigating today's complexities. For decades, companies have used a just-in-time inventory model to reduce excess supply and create a lean production process. But recently, we've seen firms take a more conservative approach with a just-in-case supply used to avoid running out of stock. The pandemic-induced devastation of supply chains put a spotlight on some of the challenges we face and exposed vulnerabilities in the just-in-time model. But does that mean this process is no more? What lessons have we learned? And what more needs to be done to ensure reliable, on-time delivery of goods? Joining me to help answer some of these questions is Greg Plemmons, Senior Vice President of Sales for Old Dominion Freight Line, and Bob Costello, Chief Economist and Senior Vice President, International Trade Policy and Cross-Border Operations for the American Trucking Associations. Thank you both for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So, Greg, let me start with you and talking about the supply chain disruptions. We've been seeing them now for nearly the past 3 years. Where do we stand now? What are you hearing from shippers?
Thanks, Jonathan. Some of our customers are sticking with a supply chain based around just in time, but others have either already or are in the process of making some adjustments. A number of customers have told me they have already or plan to increase inventory going forward to avoid the shortages that plagued them in 2021 and even into this year. Others have talked about shortening their supply chains. And so I think shippers have learned a great deal over the last 3 years or so. Unfortunately, some of them the hard way.
Yeah, a lot of lessons learned, Bob. And you've used this term, just-in-time plus. So tell us about that. What does that mean, just-in-time plus?
Yeah, so I do think that if you look at manufacturing across the board, they've operated on some fairly lean inventories. And what happened was the pandemic sort of exacerbated something that was percolating under the surface. And as we got, a lot of companies realized, and just one little hiccup in their supply chain and the whole thing gets thrown off. And while they were driving out costs for a very long time, and that was a good thing, obviously, it's that there wasn't much cushion. So this idea of just-in-time plus is, I think a lot of companies are sort of looking at their entire supply chain, some of which spans the entire globe, and realizing, we need to keep a little bit more in stock. I don't think they're going to go to a lot more, right? I don't think that, and they're going to do it strategically, right? Also on key components and so forth. But I do think there is this idea that everybody's sort of reassessing now that we're getting a little bit of a breather. That's the good thing too. The supply chain is catching up a little bit, right? I mean, there's still problems throughout the economy, but things are improving a bit. So as we get to this point where we get a little bit of a breather, I think a lot of manufacturers, and really throughout the supply chain, not just manufacturers, but they still have strong order books. That's good, but they're going to see, what can we build a little bit of stock in? We're not going back to the just-in-time environment, but we're going to go to a little bit just-in-time plus as to make sure that we have, if something doesn't come in exactly when we're expecting it, that we don't have to shut down the factory overall.
So something between just-in-time and just-in-case there.
Yeah.
So, Greg, as we talk about lessons learned and reevaluating the supply chain, are you seeing companies place greater demands on carriers to help them manage the inventory?
I don't know if whether demands is exactly the right word, but I believe the events of the last few years really have highlighted the importance of a close relationship between shippers and their carriers. Shippers now more than ever need reliable, predictable service from their carriers, and we see shippers in general being willing to pay a bit more upfront to avoid costly delays and penalties and even lost business that can result from supply chain disruptions.
So, Greg, let's talk about e-commerce and the demand that e-commerce brought to the shipping industry here. What have you seen in regards to that?
Well, e-commerce is a phenomenon that continues and will continue to grow. I think it has shifted supply chains, in particular for retailers. At Old Dominion, play primarily in the space of moving freight into the distribution centers. And as the e-commerce trend has been, in some cases, next day or even same day delivery to their customers. And so that requires additional distribution centers. And so we think that plays well into the LTL space going forward.
I mean, Bob, it seems like everybody is buying everything online now, especially after the pandemic. So do you think that is straining how companies manage their inventories?
Well, first, let me start by saying I completely agree with you. I think if you look at households and consumers, what we were buying online prior to the pandemic to what we are buying online now has changed dramatically. And it was in a slow sort of slog that way. And like a lot of things we found out in our economy, the pandemic just accelerated trends that were already there. I mean, I can tell you that, me personally, I definitely bought larger ticket items that I would have never thought about getting delivered to my house on a pallet or in my driveway. And in fact, we did it during the pandemic out of really necessity, right? And we had to do it. And I think that's a good point overall. Is some of the trends I look at as an economist is when the pandemic hit and so many people were still working, many at home that were not working at home prior, but they were still making incomes and they weren't traveling and they weren't going all over. And so they started buying this stuff. 2021, we saw personal consumption expenditures of goods after inflation go up 12.5%. It was insane. And so a big part of that was e-commerce. Now, I do think there is an effect of people wanting to get back in the stores a little bit and so forth. But I can tell you whether it's big ticket items that are brought by bigger ticket items that were brought by LTLs, not necessarily package delivery companies, or even food items and so forth that we never thought about buying prior to the pandemic. We are doing that. And of course, that has an impact on supply chains and how companies deal with that. And again, I think we're at a junction where we can take a little bit of a breather on some of the stuff. The rate of growth is slowing. We are probably going to see, not necessarily in e-commerce, but overall this year, we'll see personal consumption of goods after inflation slip just a little bit. Next year, likely just fall just a hair, not too terribly much, even though I think, the economy is probably going to enter into a mild recession, at least for a quarter or two. So I think everybody's going to get a breather here. We went through 2 years of just insanity with supply chains. Heck, I got people, when I tell people what I do for a living and they're like, before they're like, oh, that's interesting. And now they're like, oh, supply chain stuff. They know all about it, right? It's pretty cool. And so, but yeah, I think that those accelerated trends are essentially here to stay. And I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I think it's, now there's going to be, I think, and it's something Greg said earlier, I think the relationship between carriers and shippers has never been more important. We give it a lot of lip service. We give it, in the past and talk about these things, but it truly is important in this sort of environment where things have changed dramatically and can change on a dime, right? So I think we're continuing to move in the right direction there.
So, Greg, when you look at and talk about these big changes we've been discussing here, what do you think are some of the attributes that a business needs in order to manage these changes now?
Right. I think one of the most important things that shippers can do, in addition, obviously, to partnering with reliable carriers, is to plan far ahead and communicate with their carriers in areas like growth projections, new or expanded facilities, volume shifts, lane changes, et cetera. Really boils down to good, solid two-way communication between the shippers and their carriers is absolutely critical. And so it's important for carriers to thoroughly understand their customers and vice versa. The sharing of good, solid data in both directions will help to reduce risks and really optimize the relationship. So it's just good old-fashioned communication. Both
old-fashioned, but so critical. And it's such a thing that a lot of people overlook here. So I know, Bob, you spent a lot of your career looking at the big picture here when it comes to the transportation industry. And one question that comes up is, how does surface transportation play a role in supporting all of these changes here that we're talking about?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. You think about it. Trucking overall is 70% of the freight tonnage moved around this country is moved on truck. And even when it moves on another mode like rail, it still needs to go on a truck at some point. But with that said, these modes are much more complements than they are substitutes, right? We all need each other. So, I know there's concern again about a rail strike. I will tell you that would be really bad news for the trucking industry. If we think about, we're talking about factories. I tell a lot of people, first of all, less than 10% of all truck and train freight is competitive. Less than 10%, right? And now in that less than 10%, it's highly competitive. But think about it this way. There's a lot of factories out there that have truck movements coming in to supply whatever widgets they're making in that factory. But there's also a lot of those factories have railheads, and the rails come in, and then what goes out of those factories are truck movements as well. So you got truck and train coming in, and you got truck going out. And if we don't have that rail component coming in, that in short order is going to dry up freight pretty quickly for us. And so I'm hopeful that they're going to, get that rectified. But I think that sort of is a good recent example of all these modes work together along with shippers and so forth to keep this continue to go through the supply chain. And one little thing gets messed up in there, right? And everything can get screwed up. So I think it's a good lesson for all of us that through the pandemic and what's happened afterwards with the supply chain and all, there's not a lot of room for cushion. And even if we build a little bit more in there, which I'm expecting to happen, we still don't have, we all need to work together, and all these modes need to work together. And to Greg's point, I think it is so accurate that communication is the key between shippers and their customers as well. And their trucking companies. Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realize just how many moving parts there are when it comes to the shipping industry, the transportation industry, and that it all has to coordinate and work together. And so, Greg, your thoughts on this, particularly when it comes to the suppliers and their timeliness, their consistency, what role do they have in making sure that just in time works?
I think Bob makes a great point there. There simply is not the capacity in the trucking industry for any meaningful percentage of that rail freight to shift over to that mode. Some of it would happen, but it would be a devastating blow to the supply chain if that were to happen. With regard to suppliers and the timeliness, our customers tell us that they have, many of them, begun measuring their suppliers against tighter KPIs. They've instituted KPIs in some cases and really begun measuring the performance of their suppliers. And in some cases, that translated even into fines and penalties for non-performance for those suppliers. And so other customers have had to broaden the supplier base, or in some cases, shorten their supply chain to be sure they have access to the materials they need to be successful.
So, Bob, your thoughts on that? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Listen, the supply chain needs to, this idea that we all need to work together. And one of the most important parts of the supply chain is what we can't forget about, and I know Greg doesn't at all, and that is the driver, right? It's kind of interesting. I've been saying lately that the rest of the economy is caught up to us in the trucking industry with labor issues. And, we've seen this for a long time with drivers. And, a lot of times you talk to drivers and you have fleets that, are just great to their drivers. And then they turn around to the fleet's customers and they're treated poorly. And then they're like, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. Right. And I don't need to do that. And so I stress that a lot to shippers, receivers, anybody that has interactions with drivers. We got to treat these people with the respect they deserve. And I'm hopeful that that's another positive outcome out of the pandemic. Drivers got a lot of good, and rightly so, a lot of good press on making deliveries through the depths of the pandemic. But I think Greg's exactly right. Everybody's got to work together, including making sure our drivers are treated well, not just from their employers, but also from their employers' customers and then those folks' customers.
Yeah, it seems especially critical in this labor market. And Greg, I know you've got to say something about that. This must be a major focus for you guys.
Well, it truly is. And I'm glad Bob made the point. It's the drivers truly are the lifeblood of what we do. We're very fortunate here at Old Dominion, I think the LTL industry in general, that our turnover rate for drivers is much lower than, for example, in the truckload industry. But they're a valuable resource. Not a day goes by that I don't hear from a customer about something cool that an Old Dominion driver did for them. And, it's just usually multiple times a day. So I think the point that Bob makes about taking care of these folks and treating them with respect and getting them in and away from the docks quickly and safely, really an important point.
Yeah, they're probably, if not the most essential, one of the most essential parts of this whole supply chain process. But, Bob, another essential part is the manufacturers, suppliers. And I want to ask you about some of the, big changes we hear about in the news, frankly, and that is bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. Do you think that is something that a lot of firms are thinking about?
It's referred to as, onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring. There's all sorts of terms for it now. But the short answer is yes. I think that those trends are real and they will continue. But let me give you a little bit longer answer. And that is, it took 25 years to set up manufacturing in Asia. It's mainly China, but Asia in general. That is not coming back to North America overnight. But there is a trend across the globe of, think about what some of the tariffs we've seen on international trade. The pandemic obviously has done that with COVID-0 in China. There's a lot of trends where a lot of, companies are saying, I'm going to keep that plant in Asia, but that's going to serve my Asian market. And then I'm going to sort of bring, start either, expand production that I've already got in North America. And by the way, that might be the US, that might be Canada, that might be Mexico. We've got the new USMCA agreement between all three countries. I think that will help expand all of that. So I think listen, it may keep inflation a little sticky in that, we exported because of cheaper wages in Asia. We exported a lot of our inflation over the years. That may not be the case if we bring it back. But I do think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be more like drips and not a tidal wave of it coming back. It takes time, but I absolutely think you will see more of that as we go out in the next 10, 15 years.
So, Greg, I'm going to give the final thoughts to you with that in mind, speaking about all these changes, whether it's manufacturing, supply chains. What do you think the future looks like, particularly when it comes to just in time or just in case? Which direction are we leaning?
Oh, I think we're somewhere in the middle. I like Bob's term of just in time plus. I think there's definitely the idea of a cushion being built in the supply chains. We are beginning to hear from customers about real world examples of moving, nearshoring, onshoring, whatever term you'd like to use. We're beginning to see real examples of that happening. I completely agree that it's going to be a slow process, though. There's a lot of variables, a lot of complexities that come along with that. But overall, I think the supply chain challenges that we've seen over the last couple of years have regulated to some degree, but I think we'll continue to see the current challenges and probably new challenges faced going forward. But, the industry has always adjusted well to challenge, and I expect that'll be the case going forward.
Challenges and changes. Certainly a lot to consider here when deciding on an inventory management strategy. And as we've discussed, making the most of inventory requires planning and a good understanding of current and future customer demand, which is clearly not an easy task. So thank you both, Greg and Bob, for a great conversation and for sharing your insights. That's going to do it for us today. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our other episodes as part of the Cargo Shorts series. For more information and materials on this topic, be sure to visit the resources section of the Old Dominion Freight Line website at odfl.com.